In this video, I'll show you how to set up dynamic client registration in the Curity Identity Server version 2.1. New in this version, every OAuth profile can be configured to allow for clients to dynamically register. In the general section of the profile, you'll see a toggle where this can be enabled. You can either register clients based on other clients, making them effectively templates, or you can allow for untemplatized dynamic client registration. I'll enable templatized. In either case, you have to specify where to store the dynamic clients. When clients are based on a template, the only information that is stored in the database is the hash of the secret and the client ID that's generated. When doing non-templatized dynamic client registration, other information is stored in there, like the response types and the grant types of the dynamic client that's registered. Now that I've enabled templatized dynamic client registration, I can, in any client that I have in my profile, specify that it is a template on which other clients will dynamically register. I do that by enabling the toggle within the client registration. Now I need to specify how should the client authenticate to the dynamic client endpoint. In this case, I'll say that the user must authenticate. To say and to specify which authenticators the user must authenticate with, I pick another client. So I'll register them based on this client-assisted example. The ones you'll see here in the list are ones that allow for the user to authenticate. I can also allow for another client, such as www, to perform the authentication, each of which have different authentication requirements. Once I've done that, I need to add a new endpoint. So I can create a new endpoint called dynamic, for example. And I can select its type. And now I need to assign that endpoint to a server. So on the deployment section of the system, I can specify that my admin node will run this dynamic client registration endpoint. Now, as long as my new configuration changes are valid, I can commit those. Now that they are valid, I can actually perform dynamic client registration. Let me show you how to do that using an example that ships with the 2.1 release. If you look in the examples directory, you'll find this and can run it for yourself. Here I've configured the assisted token client ID to be the one that is allowed to authenticate for my templatized client, which I specify on the second field there as dynamic client template. I also need to provide the dynamic client registration endpoint, as that can vary based on your configuration. Once I've done that, I can authenticate the user as was specified in the configuration. Now I do that, and I get an initial access token that's used to call the dynamic client registration endpoint. The result of this now is a client ID and a secret that is randomly generated and can be used to perform the different flows that are configured in that client, such as the code flow. Now that we have a dynamic client who has its own client ID and secret, let's go ahead and use one of the allowed capabilities for the template, which was the code flow. If I access the authorized endpoint using that new dynamically generated client ID, I can ask for the OpenID connect scope in response. I don't have to sign in because I already signed in during the process of getting the initial token. So I can redeem this code now to get an access token for my dynamic client. The response is an access token, a refresh token, and an ID token. Using the assisted token as an example for getting started is helpful, but it obscures a little bit of what's going on when getting the initial access token. To see that a little more clearly, let's do the code flow using the www client. Here I make a request using that client. I'm already logged in, so I get a code. Now I can redeem that code using not the www client or the dynamic client, but instead using the www client and its secret. Here what you see is an access token, not a refresh token, and not an ID token, and you can see that the scope for this was DCR. So now I can actually use this one-time access token to request a new client. So I can go over here, use that as my authorization header, and in my body, this is the interesting part, it's JSON. I have a software ID of dynamic client template. This is what the assisted token was example was doing when it called that API. It was taking the information from that text field and calling this endpoint with the access token that it got after the user had logged in. So if I do this, now I get a new client and a new secret. So there. Now I have a new client ID and a new client secret that I could also use to do the code flow. The reason that I could do this with the www client and the assisted token client is because those two, if you remember, on the template were both allowed to do authentication. So here I have each of those two. So an access token from either of those is allowed to do dynamic client registration as long as the scope that it had includes DCR. And we requested that in the initial request when we did the code flow, which you can see here. So if that DCR scope is missing, the client, when it tries to do dynamic client registration, will get access denied. So with that, you can play more with dynamic client registration in 2.1. If you go to the customer portal, you'll find sample configuration that has all of this set up for you, and you will be able to start playing with the examples right away. If you have questions, of course, let us know. It's support@curity.io.